edition of the Sunday School Teacher Workshop, as I've kind of come to call it. So this week we are moving away from Zechariah back to the book of Ezra. And the reason why is because we are continuing on in our march through the post-exilic literature. So we are going to find our place in chapter 4, and our text actually starts way down in verse 24, carries us over to the first two verses of chapter 5, then has us move over to chapter 6. Just as a reminder, the first 6 chapters of Ezra, for the most part, by normative scholarly consensus, is considered to be before the time of Ezra. Of course, there are differing opinions with respect to that, and I would love to have time over a series of a few weeks to go through the literature that seems to suggest that Ezra may actually have been a part of the initial group of exiles that went back, or one of the subsequent groups of exiles that went very soon after the first wave of exiles went back. The theories are out there, and there's quite a bit of Bible that may support that. But having said that, the easiest way of teaching this is using the normative theory that Ezra's events, as goes his life, is separated from the time of Zerubbabel by roughly 60, maybe 70 years. But the reason why I bring that up is pretty much because of the content of this chapter, which I understand that beginning in verse 24 pretty much just cuts out all of chapter 4, but as teachers, if we're going to help our students understand the context, we have to look at the bigger picture of what's going on inside the chapter. So let's work through that a little bit. I'll start in chapter 4 with verse 1. An interesting verse here, as it says, "When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel." The reason why I say that is because as we'll look here in verses 3 through 5 and get a bit of a better or clearer picture of who these people are, the question of why the word enemies was used in verse 1 to describe these people becomes a little questionable, or at least it should in our minds, if we're familiar with the larger context of Scripture. And by that, I mean the books that have come prior to this particular moment in time. And if we're going to look at the prospect of the normative theory that the events of Ezra's day are roughly 70 years after the time of Zerubbabel, and Zechariah as a prophet is coming back with that initial wave of exiles under Zerubbabel, then in the time of Zechariah, as far as Ezra's own exodus and his wave of exiles coming back, that's in a sense, if you'll notice on the screen, I'm using my fingers here, still part of the pre-exilic period. It's truly not, because obviously with Zerubbabel, Zechariah, Jeshua, that generation of leaders, and they mark the first wave of exiles coming back home. It's the exodus beginning and the exile kind of coming to an end, but as you consider the fact there are multiple waves of exiles that will follow them afterward, then everybody embarks on their own version or edition of the exodus and the exile itself coming to an end, because as long as Jews are still scattered out amongst the ruins of what was the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, all now controlled by the Persian Empire, and coming back home, they are still locked away in exile. So with that in mind, one of the issues that we run into are the words that certainly one of the more obvious pre-exilic prophets, Isaiah, had to say with respect to the role that the nations would play in the regathering or ingathering of Israel back to the land after the great conflagration of their judgment from Assyria and then Babylon, resulting in an exile, and then, of course, a new subsequent exodus. And I'm talking about material right around Isaiah 35-ish, and then, of course, when we get to Isaiah 60 and beyond. He speaks very clearly of the role of the nations coming alongside Israel, and again, playing a very instrumental part in not only beautifying the nation, beautifying the city of Jerusalem and the temple, but joining in with Israel, making the temple itself a house of prayer for all nations. So if that is the standard that a pre-exilic prophet, a couple of centuries before the exile from Babylon begins, and of course we're seeing it coming to its end now in the words of Ezra in these first 6 chapters, that should be one of the key expectations of this community, are coming back with the blessing of Cyrus and all of the permissions and privileges that come with that, his royal decrees that they bear in hand to be able to build the temple. And with that, they have wagon loads of wealth that they have already accumulated before they leave. And then, of course, they have open access to the treasuries for more offerings to not only build, but even to sacrifice. And so when they come back to Jerusalem and they actually start the process of laying the foundation of the temple to then build the walls upon it, they should be expecting an invitation from them to be sent out to people to want to build the temple. Now, of course, we have no idea from the text what they thought that looked like, but in this portion of Ezra chapter 4, and it's really one of the few places we have in the Old Testament, they have a group of people who are already, in a sense, pre-staged to come to them. So, verse 2, these people that are at this moment termed enemies approach Zerubbabel and the family heads, and they said to them, "Let us build with you, for we also worship your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of King Esarhaddon of Assyria brought us here." So 2 Kings 17, go all the way back there. Familiarize yourself with that again. The deportation of all the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel under this particular king that's mentioned here, and then with that, all the people he brought into the land, and then some of the issues that they run into. And with that, I mean, of course, there's going to be a few generations that will pass in order for this to kind of fruesce, but you have Jews that are left behind, or Israelites. At this point in history, they're not really called Jews, but they're left behind in the land, and then others from other parts of the Assyrian Empire that are Gentiles are moved into the land, and then for whatever reason, they want to attach themselves to this very small remnant of Israelite people, and they want to start worshiping the God that they assume to be the local deity, and that being Yahweh. And when they start attempting to try to worship him the way that they worship their gods, God sends lions amongst them to ravish them. And with that, the Assyrian authorities then send back one of the priests to go and instruct the people how they're supposed to properly worship the Lord. And of course, the Israelites apparently had long since forgotten the law of Moses. At least we can assume that, of the remnant that's left behind there. And so with that, that creates the construct of what we see here in this particular context of people who now for generations have been worshiping Yahweh and potentially have been doing it maybe rather close to the very precepts that Moses gives in the heart of the Torah in the book of Leviticus, as best they can, obviously without much of a priestly remnant left behind. And so they too anticipate the prospect, apparently, of a temple to be built. And they don't seem to come, at least in these few verses, with a pretense of wanting to do Israel harm, or the remnants of Judah and Benjamin, the two tribes that have come together to start this process of beginning an exodus, and then, of course, capping this off with not only entering into Jerusalem, but starting to rebuild both temple and wall. We'll get to that here in just a second. That's hugely important. Consider also, this comes off the heels of chapter 3. This is chapter 4. And in chapter 3, we mark the entrance of this wave of exiles under Zerubbabel and Jeshua the high priest coming into the city. And when they get there, they've gotten there just in time for the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, or Shelters, in the 7th month. One of the high holy days, the 3 feasts that all Israelite men are supposed to appear before the Lord. The reason why this is important is because if you'll go back and study the words of Moses in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, there are very strict rites of observance in the cultic manner for how this festival is supposed to be celebrated. There's the obvious thing of the shelters that everybody's supposed to build with leafy boughs or, branches from trees that grow by rivers. There's that specification, but there's also the cultic practice of what to offer on what day. And part of those offerings required 70 bulls to be offered during this time period. And the reason why, according to Jewish tradition, is because these bulls marked the nations and their participation in the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, we have to also be familiar with what the Feast of Tabernacles was supposed to represent. It represents marking the occasion of when God was walking with Israel through the wilderness, preserving them, pillar of cloud by day, fire by night, breaking open rocks to give them water, raining down bread from heaven, bringing in swarms of quail to give them the meat that they needed. And with that, while this is a picture of how God sustains Israel, the idea of it becoming a perpetual observance year in and year out, and then offering up these bulls that were not offered at any point during their wilderness wandering is to mark that God is wanting to do the same thing with the nations. God is walking with them in their wilderness, and he is seeking to draw them in to this practice with Israel with the idea that someday this will be the feast that all of them get a chance to celebrate in. So we have just the remnants of Judah and Benjamin celebrating it in Ezra 3, and the point I make is that we've got some measure of tokenism going on there with respect to the idea of we recognize the nations have a role in this. Then, sometime later, but immediately moving on into chapter 4, we have people of the nations coming forward and wanting to join in this process of building the temple. But what is the response in verse 3? Zerubbabel, the Davidic descendant, who is now their governor, Jeshua, the Aaronic descendant, the descendant of Aaron, who was the high priest, and the other heads of Israel's family answered them, you may have no part with us in building a house for our God, since we alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. So we have to assume that some of these people who they're talking to may very well be purebred Israelites, although it's very unlikely. Most of them, if they have any Israelite blood in them, they're probably half-blood at this point, and maybe even some Gentiles who, again, have come alongside them. We don't have the term God-fearer being used like we do in the New Testament yet, but nonetheless a precursor for that. So these people who seemingly want to join in and accomplish the very thing that not only Isaiah said, but this is where it would behoove us as teachers to recognize that we have more than one book or part of the Bible that's in play here, not just prophecies from people like Isaiah, but even the words of Zechariah in his 14 chapters, Haggai in his 2 chapters, as they are noted to be leaders during this time period too, that comment on this. In Zechariah in chapter 6, we alluded to this last week when we were looking at the prospect of Jeshua, the high priest, being the sign of the branch, that messianic title that Isaiah begins to use to describe the Davidic descendant, who in his use of it's going to be a king and resurrect the line of kings from Jesse's stump, coming off as a new shoot. But Zechariah uses this term to signify that not only will it be a royal descendant of David, but somehow it's going to intertwine with the lineage of Aaron as well and combine the offices into one, and that this person known as the branch, who's now responsible for building the Lord's temple as he branches out from this place, in every sense the pun is intended. But verse 15, to end that, says this: people who are far off will come and build the Lord's temple. People in this sense, as it's used almost exclusively throughout the Old Testament, refers to the nations. This is not the ethnic descendants of Abraham in mind here. So the Gentiles who are far off will come and build the Lord's temple. And Zechariah uses this as a sign to say, this is how you will know that the Lord has sent me amongst you as a prophet in carrying this word, which means that at some point, either in his time or within a generation or two after that, these people will have to see this sign come to pass. So if Zechariah, in this portion of Ezra, is one of these key leaders who are amongst this first group of exiles coming back, and he has spoken these words of chapter 6 at some point, presumably before the events of Ezra chapter 4, then the question then is how did they take Isaiah's words and Zechariah's words, and how were they supposed to act on that? And again, the person who is translating and commemorating the events here, beginning in verse 1 with the use of the words enemy there, really raises a stark question. And was it a bad thing that they turned these people away? We can presume that part of the reason why they turned them away is because it's possible that maybe with implementing these people as part of this process, that they would have eventually corrupted the practice of the cultic observance of Yahweh's worship in this place by offering up sacrifices to pagan deities or whatever. But we don't have that in the text. And if they assume that, then that can in every way be presumed on our part to be an assumption that they made in error. And then in this, it winds up causing friction for them. And as is often the case in many of these stories in Scripture, the wrong decision usually winds up creating a series of consequences that people have to wind up living with. And it creates, no doubt, a source of conflict. When we get to verse 6 and beyond, verse 4, then the people who were already in the land discouraged the people of Judah, and they made them afraid to build. They also bribed officials to act against them to frustrate their plans throughout the reign of King Cyrus of Persia. until the reign of King Darius of Persia. But we can't read the context of verses 4 and 5 back into 1 to just assume that they came there to do that all along. Now, there may have been Persian officials there and other, as it might be termed, Canaanite people that were living there at the time who did not want to see any sort of a Jewish remnant reestablish a foothold in the land, much less build a temple. But we have to take into consideration the parameters and the impact of the words of Isaiah and Zechariah. Anyway, so notice the subheadings there on the screen, though, and I appreciate the translators of the CSB. I'm sure many other study Bibles do the same with organizing in this way. Verses 4 through 5, opposition to rebuilding the temple. But then verses 6 and beyond is opposition to building the city. I think a lot of times when we talk about the context of this passage, we only have the idea that this first group of exiles came back and they started building the temple, and that was what they were being opposed to stop doing. And we have really no consideration about what else was going on building project-wise. But the context of verses 6 and beyond make it quite clear that they were building more than just the temple at that time. In fact, Ezra in later places, such as chapter 9, is going to make use of the fact that not only were they busy building the temple before his arrival, but they even started building a wall, which, of course, Ezra arrives well in advance before Nehemiah does. So as teachers, I'm telling you it's important for us to understand that when the first wave of exiles came back, they were doing what they felt was necessary to not only start the process of building the temple, but also fortify the city. This is the process that they really attempt to try to stop. But the temple gets wrapped up in that. So verse 6, and moving beyond that, at the beginning of the reign of Ahasuerus, the people who were already in the land wrote an accusation against the residents of Judah and Jerusalem. Then during the time of King Artaxerxes of Persia, we have these characters here by those names, and the rest of his colleagues wrote to King Artaxerxes, and the letter written in Aramaic, translated, went on to say, hey, we want you to do a search in the archives because these people are attempting to try to rebuild the city. You'll notice the employment of the word city many times throughout the context. In Hebrew, that comes from the word kiryah, from the basic word or root kur, which means city. In every context it's written in, it's always city. So in this letter written to Artaxerxes and perhaps also Ahasuerus, I'll get to that in just a second, they're proposing that a search in the archives be had to see what kind of people lived in this particular area of the world in the time when they had their own sense of sovereignty and autonomy, their own kingdom. And of course, the correspondence that comes back reveals that, at least in the estimation of the Persian monarch and his advisors, these people were rather unscrupulous. It wouldn't be in their best interest to allow them to rebuild the temple and then fortify the city. Doing both at the same time may escalate things a little too quickly, and with that, these people may make an effort to try to declare rebellion. Now, we also have to make an effort as teachers to try to at least grasp a little bit about what's going on here, geopolitically and historically. Now, the timeline I somewhat hinted at last week in both my breakdown here and then in the lesson that I taught online was the conventional understanding that we have Cyrus the Persian, and he dies around 530 BC, so really just a few years after he actually relinquished the exiles to go back home. And then after him, his son Cambyses, actually Cambyses II, named after Cyrus's father, reigns for roughly 8 years, is busy trying to conquer Egypt. And with that, segments of the Persian Empire began to get a little bit unsettled. And then with his abrupt death, we have a person who claims to be another son of Cyrus the Great, I believe, or maybe he claimed to be the son of Cambyses. I'm a little fuzzy on that one, I'm sorry. But nonetheless, he attempted to try to, most scholars think it was a usurpation of the throne. Some see it as a legitimate taking of the throne, which was rightfully his, but almost every historian is divided on the idea of whether or not that person who actually succeeded Cambyses was the legitimate heir to the crown. However that turned out in the end with respect to whether he was a legitimate heir or not, this particular person, known by some as goes by the name of Barda or maybe Pseudo-Smyrnus, different scholars use different terms. The next ruler after him was Darius the Great. And so Darius the Great, he's not actually a direct descendant of Cyrus. He begins a new Persian dynasty, and after him comes Xerxes the First or the Great, who was responsible for the assault on Greece, the battle at Thermopylae, the burning of Athens, and then, of course, after him, Artaxerxes the First. With the exception of the title Xerxes, we have the listing of all these other kings, and it's often assumed by most scholars, with the conventional reckoning of the chronology of Persia's emperors, the dates assigned to them, and the use of these titles in these stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, that those are the kings reflected there. But there are some who also make very compelling and good arguments that these names of Ahasuerus, even Darius and Artaxerxes are somewhat fluid and are used even in Persian sources to describe the same king. In other words, that while one king may be named Darius, he may talk about himself using the very term Artaxerxes or Ahasuerus. And you're like, well, that would be confusing, right? I mean, what's the guy's name? Well, think of it like this. The writer of Hebrews, as he is talking about the king Melchizedek, making the case that he is regarding his familiarity with Jesus and the parallelism between the two, breaks down that person's name and his role as king. We remember Melchizedek was king of Jerusalem, but he interprets his name for us and tells us that Melchizedek was king of righteousness because that's what his name actually means. But as king of Jerusalem, or at the time it was known as the city of Salem, the title or the word Salem itself means peace, and so thereby, not only was he king of righteousness, but he was also king of peace. So in other words, in the ancient world, even before the time of the writing of the letter of Hebrews, those people clearly understood names have meanings. Royal names have very significant meanings. And the reason why I bring this up is because it's entirely possible that the people being mentioned here, Darius and then Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes, may very well be one and the same person. Now you might think, well, why does it matter? In essence, in some ways, it doesn't truly matter. But the reason why I bring this up is because it's possible that, depending on how you see it, it may really kind of distort the context of chapter 4. Because at the beginning of the chapter, during the time of the reign of Cyrus on into Darius, we've got some opposition against building the temple. But then we move into the reign of Ahasuerus, which according to popular theory would be Xerxes, which comes after Darius and separates these accounts by more than just a few decades. And then we have some opposition to building the city, which creates some questions as to what was going on when they actually moved into the city. Were they only building the temple first? Were they building the temple and the city together? And then, of course, we have the mention of Artaxerxes, which is the grandson of Darius. And then after that, we move back into chapter 5 with the temple building being resumed, and we go from Darius to Ahasuerus, which could be his son Xerxes, then Xerxes' son Artaxerxes, and then chapter 5, we go back to Darius. And with that, it doesn't seem to flow very well. But in the theory that maybe Darius is also known by the terms Ahasuerus, which would make him the king of the story of Esther as well, and may be known as Artaxerxes, would also make him the king of Nehemiah's story, and that would mean all of these stories combine in a relatively short time period, which gives all the more credence to Zechariah's prophecies. So Artaxerxes gives the response to them that indeed he read the letter, he doesn't agree it's a good idea for them to build a city, and he wants it halted. But notice with the halting of the building of the city, there's no mention made about whether or not they should halt building the temple. But the people presume that's the case. Not only the inhabitants of the land, but the governors and authorities as well. So in verse 24, which actually starts our text, now the construction of God's house, the temple in Jerusalem, had stopped and remained at a standstill until the second year of King Darius of Persia. And then beginning in chapter 5, but when the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, began to rebuild God's house in Jerusalem. So back to the idea of what's going on geopolitically. So when this potential usurper who attempts to try to take the throne after the death of Cambyses is deposed by Darius. Darius has the threat of lots of different rebellions potentially going on. And so with that, the authorities who rule with the power of the Persian crown in this particular area where these Jews have resettled and are attempting to build, they see this as a potential mark of rebellion against the crown, as rumors and actions are both being spread and conducted throughout the Persian Empire. And if they see this as an act of rebellion, they are sending a letter, one of many letters that were sent to Darius when he took the crown, stating that this action could be a potential threat against you. But instead of them stopping this, they let them continue building the temple until a royal edict or official edict could be had. And so they requested another search of the archives be made. And with that, they said, apparently these people claim that Cyrus states that he gave them not only permission, but votive offerings to go back with, released all of the precious and sacred articles from the temple that was destroyed under Nebuchadnezzar to go back with them. So if you can verify that that's what's going on, we would really appreciate that. And then tell us, in essence, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to allow them to continue or immediately shut this down? And so Darius gives a search, and when he does, he sends back word and says, do nothing to stand in their way. If anything, help them in the sense of giving them the support they need, not necessarily lend your hands to the task. If anybody attempts to try to obstruct this, they are to be executed in a rather heinous and awful way. And then that brings us into chapter 6. So hopefully if you caught on to what I was saying, it's entirely possible that Artaxerxes is Darius, is Ahasuerus. I'm not saying that's the case. I usually try to follow the more chronological or a conventional way of looking at this because in some ways it makes it easier to teach. But if that's the case, it raises the question then of the simplicity, or I should say raises the point of the simplicity then of one king versus two different kings making the edict as to stop building and then restart building. So chapter 6 carries us through Darius' official search and then decree, and then beginning in verse 13, we have Tattenai, the governor of the region west of the Euphrates River, and then Shethar-Bozenai and their colleagues diligently carrying out everything that King Darius had decreed. So the Jewish elders continued successfully with the building under the prophesying of Haggai the prophet, Zechariah the son of Iddo, and they finished the building according to the command of God, the God of Israel, and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, who very well could also be Artaxerxes of Persia. The house was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of King Darius. And notice what we have after this, but celebrating this, the dedication of the temple with the Passover. Now, in many ways, this series of events is written to largely mimic and follow the compilation of the Torah. And part of that would be because Ezra, if he has a hand in forming this book that recollects these accounts, who again, it's possible that Ezra may have been alive through all of it, or at least the events of chapters 7 through 10, would see these as a wave or waves of successive Exodus movements, right? But they're patterning that after what you see in the actual Torah itself. Case in point, what happens in Egypt in the book of Exodus? Israel is being birthed out of that exile by God divinely stirring the heart of a king, albeit that Pharaoh rebelled against God, while this Persian monarch agrees, and he follows the stirring of God, rousing his heart to comply with God's wishes, though he doesn't recognize that who it is who's doing this to him. But nonetheless, he is complicit with this, and he lets these people go. All right, Israel in the Exodus story are leaving, and eventually they're going to come into the land, and when they do, they're going to start building the tabernacle that God has given the instructions for. However, before we get there, they have to stop at Sinai. Moses doesn't tell them in Egypt, we're going to go to the land and then build God's house. He starts to drop hints at that along the way. As he's on the eastern bank of the Red Sea, after the Egyptians are destroyed with the crossing through the Red Sea, that victory song or the song by the sea, one of the final things that Moses says is that God is going to establish a sanctuary on his holy mountain. They're going to get a very good picture of that at Sinai because God is going to dwell with them for a year, give them the instructions for the tabernacle. They'll build it. So then we get to Exodus chapter 40, the entire book of Leviticus, and the first 9 chapters of the book of Numbers. And that all carries us from the assembling of the tabernacle on the first day of the first month of the second year after the Exodus is ended, and 13 days later, they are going to celebrate the second Passover before they hitch their wagons up, disassemble the tabernacle, and then go into the land. 40 years later, when they finally get to the land, the Exodus ends with their celebration of the next great Passover. They may have celebrated it at some point in the wilderness, but the writer of the book of Joshua makes it seem as though there hadn't been a significant celebration of the Passover since the time at Sinai. And then, of course, they go into the land to begin the conquest. But after they experience the celebration of the second Passover that marks the assembling of the tabernacle, that carries us into the events of Numbers chapters 1 through 9. And then when we get to 10 and beyond, what do we have? We have, over a period of 11 chapters, 7 rebellions on the part of Israel that costs one generation the inheritance of the land, and lots of horrible misery along the way. When we move beyond chapter 6 in Ezra, mostly chapter 7 as well, and then get into chapter 8, what do we experience? These people had dedicated the temple, celebrated it with Passover. According to the biblical pattern of the narratives that have followed before, we should expect some bad things, and that's exactly what we get. Ezra comes into this community with the intent and desire, as laid out in the beginning of chapter 7, to instruct them in the law of Moses, to help purify their hearts so that they will in every way follow God and walk in the wisdom and light of his counsel, and hopefully prevent the same errors that countless generations before them had committed that led to this exile in the first place. But he has met with quite a few challenges. So, again, all of this to stir up the idea of thinking through the prospect of Exodus language and stories and patterns. And then, of course, that helps us understand how this movement in the post-exilic community is shaking up. You would think after 70 years they would have learned from their mistakes. Sadly, they don't. But it's important for us as teachers to mention this because after we get done with this portion of Ezra, we're not going to be touching this book again. We'll be instead in a couple of weeks moving on to Nehemiah. And as I understand it, with Life Action being here, that's going to kind of monkey with that a little bit. So anyway, thank you for your time.